Namaste everybody, welcome again and wishing you all a very happy Guru Purnima. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. In today's class, we will discuss a little more about how to lengthen and stabilize the lumbar region. This comes directly after our previous discussion as to how to place the arms in Urvastasan. We shall now discuss as to how both these are connected. Now let's understand the anatomy of the spine a little bit. If we look at the spine, we have the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae and the sacrum tailbone. Now, the thoracic vertebrae is encased within a rib cage. So, in order to adjust the thoracic vertebrae, we have the help of the rib cage to lift, steer, etc. Similarly, the sacrum and tailbone are encased within the pelvis. So, if we have to draw the sacrum in or broaden the region of the sacrum, we can take the assistance of the pelvis to be able to steer it. But there are two areas, that is the cervical vertebrae and the lumbar vertebrae, which really don't have this kind of an encasement which helps us manipulate or adjust that region. So, these regions tend to be a little more fluid and a little more unsupported. Within that, let's look at the region of the lumbar. As far as the lumbar is concerned, it has the pelvis below and the rib cage above it. So, if the rib cage falls down on the diaphragm towards the abdomen, then that creates a certain lumbar squish, that is a certain contraction or a compression in the lumbar region. Secondly, if the pelvis either posteriorly or anteriorly ascends towards the abdomen, then that also creates either an anterior, posterior or a lateral compression. So, if we have to keep the region of the lumbar long, free, broad, expansive and healthy, we have to look at releasing it both from the thoracic region as well as from the region of the pelvis. Okay. So, in the last video, when we talked about Urvastasan, how Urvastasan, the upper arm ends up sitting behind the ear. There is a rotational action involved here which we will discuss later. But when the upper arm sits behind the ear, it creates a broadening and a lift of the rib cage. Broadening happens at the middle and base ribs, but the entire rib cage comes up in Urvastasan. So, Urvastasan lifts the rib cage up, creating a release for the upper lumbar vertebrae. The second thing that we need to discuss is the pelvis. How to traction the pelvis and stabilize the pelvis in such a way that the pelvis doesn't interfere or ascend on the lumbar, creating any kind of a contortion or compression. Let's just see that in Supta Tadasana first. So, I am not going into the detail of how to do Supta Tadasana, but just from the perspective of the pelvis and lumbar, we would discuss one facet or one point. Now, when I lie down in Supta Tadasana, if I am very quick to lengthen my legs away, then you can see that I am resting on the floor. That is, my legs are resting, my thighs are resting, my shoulder is resting, my entire body seems like it's resting. But there is a space, you can see my fingers through, there is a space between the lower back and the floor, which means even though I am resting, the region of the cervical vertebrae and the region of the lumbar vertebrae are not resting and they are kind of hanging mid-air unsupported. Therefore, the lumbar vertebrae here has a certain unsupported, unrested condition. Here, if I bend my leg, right leg and left leg, just the aspect of bending it allows the pubic bone to roll upward towards the navel, allowing the lower back to rest. Again, if I throw my legs very quickly away, then it creates a certain moving down of the pubic bone, creating a certain lift in the lower lumbar region. If I bend my legs and allow the upper head of the pubic bone, pubic symphysis, to roll toward the navel and toward the spine, it creates a certain rest for the lower back. Here of course that adjustment rests the lower back but does not really create an extension or length in the lumbar spine. Suppose I want to lengthen the lumbar spine, then I press my feet, raise my hips just around 1 to 2 inches in the air and encase my hand around my pelvis such that the thumb comes over the anterior iliac spine, the bony projection on top. The fingers go right at the start of the gluteus muscles and my palm encases the entire bony pelvis. So the bony structure of the pelvis at the front with the anterior iliac spine, at the back with the iliac crest, and the entire bony part of the pelvis is encased in my hands. Now my idea is to equally front of the pelvis, back of the pelvis, sides of the pelvis, that is top, bottom and sides of the pelvis, traction it away from the rib cage, and you will see as I am pushing down the pelvis equally with my hands, I am creating length in the lumbar spine. So this length in the lumbar spine is achieved by keeping the pelvis away from the rib cage. So here I am lengthening my legs one after the other, allowing my pubic bone to integrate toward the navel, and as I do that, I've managed to maintain the rest and length of the lumbar spine. Now from here, having tractioned the pelvis, if I take my hand up in Urvastasan, then as I lengthen my arms in Urvastasan, the rib cage ascends up and the pelvis descends down, creating a long profile of the lumbar spine. Now, let me explain this to you a little more. When we do asana, we were talking about the hand extension in Utkatasana. So let's look at the same thing, pelvic traction in Utkatasana now. I'm standing with my heels close to the wall and I take my hand up to hold the right rope, left rope. As I told you before, the intention is not to hang on the rope. We have to use our hands grip and really trying to ascend the right edge of the rib cage at the floating rib region, broaden and ascend the left edge of the rib cage in the floating rib region, such that the spine is lengthening upward and not really hanging downward. So we have to create that length. Then I step away. We don't need the mat here. So as I step away around 1 to 1.5 feet apart, I press my feet and allow myself to feel the broadening of the sacrum. So I have to utilize the press force of my feet to ascend the femur in the socket and feel the broadening of the sacrum. Now I am tractioning the pelvis down as I allow the rib cage to be lifted up. That is your Urvastasan. So as I go down, the front, back, side ends of the pelvis traction down equally as I allow my rib cage to be ascended up. This creates a long profile at the lumbar. Now, in any asana, we have to ensure that the pelvis is stabilized. Let's say Tadasana. The pelvis is stabilized, that it doesn't dangle front and back. Pelvis is stabilized and then the rib cage is lifted up. In an asana like Utkatasana, the rib cage also lifts up and the pelvis also tractions down, giving length to the lumbar spine, which otherwise would collapse inward without support. Now, I'd like to clarify this action as being slightly different from the action that we discussed earlier in our hyperlordosis class session. When we discussed hyperlordosis, when the upper end of the buttock hits up into the lumbar, then it pushes the lumbar or allows the lumbar to drop forward. So here we are only cutting the upper buttock muscle down, creating that lack or preventing that overlordosis of the lumbar. But here we are talking about allowing the entire pelvis to really allow itself to integrate towards the feet. Keeping that, how we are able to traction the ribcage upward. So pelvis is traction down, ribcage is traction upward, giving a long profile to the lumbar spine. This has to be done in any asana, whether it's Urdhva Dhanurasana, Virabhadrasana 1 or any asana. The congestion between the ribcage and the pelvis will tend to shorten and compress the lumbar. So ribcage up, pelvis traction down. In the upcoming video, I'll show how this looks in Urdhva Dhanurasana as well. Thank you.